In theory, elections are about elevating politicians to solve the country's most complex problems. This year, some states are looking to galvanize voters with an issue that may be widely discussed, but is not a widespread problem. 8 states have questions on the ballot to explicitly ban non-citizens from voting in local elections. 7 other states have already altered their constitutions to do so. Members of Congress are also joining the conversation. Earlier this month, House Republicans passed a bill requiring proof of citizenship for voting, even though it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal races. The bill has little chance of becoming law. CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez joins me now from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Camilo, let's just get the context right here. What are the current laws on the books about non-citizens voting, and how big of a phenomenon is somehow non-citizens actually trying to vote?
Good evening, John. Non-citizen voting is rare according to all the available statistics. As you underscored, it is already illegal under U.S. law to vote in a federal election as a non-citizen, and violators of that provision of U.S. law can actually not only be jailed and fined, but deported from the U.S. And this applies to migrants who are here in the country illegally, John, but also to permanent residents, immigrants who are not U.S. citizens but who have lawful status. They also cannot vote in federal elections for president or for a member of Congress. And there is currently no state in the U.S. that allows non-citizens to vote in state elections. There is a very small handful of localities in states like Maryland and New York that do allow certain immigrants with lawful status to vote in local elections. But again, they cannot vote in federal and state elections. And in terms of how widespread this issue is, according to the data that we have available, it is not very widespread. We know that the Justice Department over the past 2 decades has prosecuted a small number of cases involving non-citizens voting in federal elections, but we're talking about dozens of cases, not hundreds, and certainly not thousands, John. And we also know that states that have been trying to target and remove non-citizens from voting rolls have found very few cases of these violations. Ohio most recently actually found 137 non-citizens in its voting system. That's out of millions of eligible voters in Ohio, John. So in sum, there is no evidence to suggest that there are any significant numbers of non-citizens voting in federal elections, certainly not enough to alter the outcome of any election.
So if it's already a felony for non-citizens to vote, why are federal lawmakers continuing to talk about this and members in Congress suggesting legislation?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, John. We do know that Republicans and former President Donald Trump have made immigration a top campaign issue this cycle, and it seems like they are trying to tie the issue of election integrity, which is a major issue among Republican primary voters, but also general election voters, and the issue of immigration. Because of the situation at the border, Republican lawmakers and former President Trump are saying that the increase in illegal immigration at the border also increases the chances, John, that non-citizens and potentially migrants who are coming across the border can vote in federal elections. Again, there has been no evidence to suggest that that is happening. There's also a more fringe claim out there, John, that the Biden administration and Democrats are actively welcoming migrants to convert them into eligible voters. There's no evidence to suggest, John, that Biden administration immigration policy, which you can certainly disagree with, John, is dictated by a desire to convert immigrants into voters. And it is also important to note that most of these migrants will never be able to vote if they can in the first place. Even those who win asylum, which, as you know, will not happen for the most of them because they're not eligible for it, have to wait 5 years as permanent residents to naturalize as U.S. citizens and obviously gain the ability to vote.
And just very briefly, Camilo, if migrants were in the States, isn't there some studies or some evidence that because their status is so fragile, that it actually leads to people not wanting to do anything that might get them in trouble, which is to say monkey around with the election system that might get them kicked out of the country, that they know that that their system is so precarious that this would be a particular place where they might basically lose the status they've worked so hard to get.
That is right, and that is the deterrence that lawmakers sought to enact when they made it a felony crime for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Not only do they face fines, John, and jail time, but they can also be deported from the U.S. even if they have lawful status. Permanent residents, unbeknownst to many people in the U.S., can also be deported just like unauthorized immigrants if they commit certain crimes. And this is one of the crimes that fits into that definition. It makes people deportable even if they're here legally, and that, according to experts, is having the desired deterrent effect and dissuading non-citizens from voting in federal elections.
Camilo Montoya-Galvez, thank you so much, Camilo.